room, and also no doubt the tens of thousands who are watching via this battery of cameras here that's obviously meant to intimidate us all on the panel. But welcome to this policy exchange event sponsored by Northrop Grumman. And we're here today to discuss security and defence policy. Well, it's a very broad subject to cover in an hour. And so to sharpen that, we're going to be asking how recent events should shape and inform our views on the current spend that we all as taxpayers spend on our armed forces through the defence budget, and therefore hope to inform Labour's defence policy accordingly. We have an excellent panel here to discuss this, and we try to make it as broadly experienced as possible. And I'll introduce the panel members as we go through. The format for it is that I'll ask each of the 5 panellists, we have one online, to speak for about 5 minutes and give their view as to what principally the Ukraine crisis means for how we should view our approach to UK defence policy. And then we'll go into a panel discussion and a Q&A. We'll keep it around the panel if there are some obvious bones of contention to get at, and then as soon as possible we'll open it up to questions from you all on the floor. I'm Air Marshal retired, Edward Stringer. I used to own all the thinking bits of UK defence, which depending on your prejudices is either a really big or a really small job, and did a bunch of operations, including being the Director of Operations in the MOD before that, and now I help Policy Exchange out through being a Senior Fellow. First off today, though, on our panel and sponsoring us, I'm very pleased to welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Northrop Grumman for UK, Europe and the Middle East, Nick Chaffee. He brings a wealth of experience, not just because he holds such a high position in this major global company, but also because before that he really set up the PA Consulting Group Defence and Security business, and therefore has a great breadth looking across the whole sector. So without any more, Nick, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss one of some pretty important issues as the world evolves around us. A little bit about Northrop Grumman and what we are and why we're relevant to this debate, maybe. Northrop Grumman isn't your usual defence and security company. We're really a technology and innovation company that focuses on the defence market, and we underpin a wide range of the key frontline assets for UK defence, from the F-35 fighter, through the radar system on the E-7 Wedgetail, through the UK submarines fleet, and even the UK submarine cybersecurity foundations. So we're a very broadly based business. In the UK, we employ nearly 1,000 people and many thousand more in our supply chain, really focused on delivering that innovation I was talking about and looking to next generation technologies and what's important to the UK. So this debate today is really important to us in terms of where defence is going and what's really critical to making sure the UK is secure in the future. You asked, Ed, kind of what's our perspective on what's happened in Ukraine and the terrible events we've seen unfold since February. I guess it's important to acknowledge that the world is learning a lot from the events in Ukraine. And it's worth bearing in mind it's not just us that's learning, it's our potential adversaries who are learning too. There are some pretty big lessons. Some of our European allies have been caught napping. In terms of their ability to respond to the events in Ukraine. So low availability of war stocks, low availability of platforms, decades of underinvestment in some of their infrastructure and capability, and poor sustainment has meant some of our key European allies have simply been unable to respond to some of the events we've seen in Ukraine. So there's a big lesson there in terms of making sure we're always ready, always available, and ready to deploy relatively quickly, given the relatively large changes in European and international defence policy. When we looked at what's actually happened since, there are some big lessons. We've learned them, the Russians have learned them, and many of our adversaries and allies have learned them. Freedom of manoeuvre, performance of the supply chain have come out as very significant issues, and ones where Russia has performed badly, which has resulted in air dominance is fundamental. The ability to control the airspace, control what happens in the air over cities and over armed forces is critical, and neither side has achieved air dominance, and that's a fundamental weakness in terms of the West in responding to the threat we're seeing. the value of ISR, the value of insight, surveillance and reconnaissance in the battle space, and just how powerful that's been, and mainly provided by Western allies to Ukrainian forces, that made a massive difference to their ability to respond to the Russian threat and respond to some of the things the Russians have been doing. Communications, always vital, always critical to enabling the warfighter to be effective on the ground, and the West has performed well there. The Russians have struggled very badly from the fact that their comms are not secure and not low observable, and as a result taken some very severe hits as a result of people tracking their comms and responding to their comms. And maybe last but not least, I'm sure there's many more, but the use of unmanned or uncrewed air vehicles, from very high-end systems, high-altitude, long-endurance systems that fly along the border between Poland and Ukraine, providing a very broad picture of what's going on across the whole of Ukraine, through to tactical commercial systems that the Ukrainians are using in the battle space. And they've used them extraordinarily effectively to provide ISR and to target their operations. So just some of the things we're seeing, and I'm sure others are seeing more, that are changing the view of the future demand for warfighting and the sort of technologies that are critical to the future. So how do we respond to that? And current events are shaping that even further. When we saw last night the value of the pound fall to its lowest level in history. And that may sound like a slightly tangential economic issue, but for defence, that's a very big issue because the value of the defence budget has just effectively dropped when it comes to importing defence assets from around the world. That's a big issue. But also defence inflation is also running highly. So we're seeing inflation in the UK running around 10%. I would guess defence inflation is running at close to double that. So that really stretches the defence budget, whatever it is, and therefore prioritises the investment in key technologies as we go forward. So really something to watch as we think about what that means for defence policy. Responding to that, well, Northrop Grumman is an innovation company, so we're busy innovating and investing in technologies at the leading edge that will shape the future of the war space. So that's multi-domain integration, joining up information from multiple sensors across multiple domains, from space, air, land, sea, and undersea, into a single picture that the warfighter can respond to and respond to very quickly, indeed instantly. Leveraging digital technology. The way defence systems are developed has fundamentally changed in the last 5 years. We've all seen how mobile phones are far more powerful than they used to be. They're no longer mobile phones, they're digital devices in your hand. We're seeing it in the automotive sector. And if you look now what's happening in defence, the same is true. So one piece of equipment can be a radar, it can be a communication system, it can be an EW system, all software-defined, hardware-enabled. And that shift in technology is really quite fundamental to what defence is and what will be over the next 2 decades. And there's a big challenge for the armed forces to respond to that and pick up and deploy those new technologies really well. Related to that, maybe my last point, conscious of time, is digital technology more broadly. We're seeing digital technology change the way defence equipment is designed and delivered. Northrop Grumman is delivering the B-21 program for the US government. It's the first ever 6th generation aircraft in terms of being invisible to radar, being deployable globally. But it's been designed and developed entirely digitally. Designed digitally, developed digitally, planning of sustainment and support digitally. The air flying testing has been done digitally. The first manufacturing has been done digitally. And even the planning of the manufacturing process has been done digitally. As a result, the program's been rolled out ahead of schedule and below budget for the first generation of a new technology, which is unknown in defence circles, I must admit. And that ability to innovate quickly and deploy, we have to apply in the UK, and we have to leverage that technology to drive the next generation of defence solutions for the UK.
Nick, thank you very much. I'm not going to recap the whole thing, but you talked really about freedom of manoeuvre, the phrase you used. You talked about supply chains. You mentioned our vulnerabilities relying on stuff from overseas, not least the financial shock we're seeing at the moment. But ultimately, you talked there about how things are moving at real speed and our ability to get ahead around the digital environment. So if I move immediately on to, that's a great segue to our next panellist, Sally Walker. Sally, until recently, was a director at GCHQ. She helped set up the National Cyber Force. She has a huge amount of operational experience, and because she was on that wing of GCHQ, She was selected to do the High Command and Staff course in the military. She has no illusions about how the military works. She now has a cyber consultancy, but she can talk about what you've introduced there, the digital element, from a non-military perspective, and maybe get into the ideas of national resilience. So I think we've got Sally on the screen. Sally, over to you.
That long ago, I wrote quite a lot down because there's a lot that could be said. As Ed said, the topic is pretty broad, and that really came down to sort of 4 broad areas of interest. What lessons Ukraine is teaching us, and there I'd just say it's important we don't lose the other lessons of the recent past, particularly fighting counter-terrorism, the fact that Russia is not China, perhaps what went wrong and what went right in Afghanistan, and more broadly. So Ukraine is one war, but it's not all wars. The second is looking to the future and making choices there. Defence cannot surely be doing everything all of the time, everywhere in the modern world. Ukraine is teaching us that if you do one thing and do it very well, you can be a very credible player in the global jigsaw. But what choices are we really going to make in the future? I could talk a little bit about the lessons that we could learn and could not learn from what we're seeing in Ukraine. I'll take those as questions. Otherwise, I risk going on far too long. And I think there's some really interesting, challenging questions around the big data environment and what is available through open source, and what is genuinely intelligence, and what is insight, and how do we process that, and how does the machinery of government need to change to adapt. But if I could only land one point with this audience, and it's different, but I hope related to what Nick has just talked about. When we designed and built the National Cyber Force, it was all about working across organisational boundaries and breaking down some of those stovepoints. But with reflection and looking at what Ukraine is doing well, we were fundamentally constrained because we could only work with whoever and whatever was already inside the tent. That's the businesses, that's the people, that's those with clearances, that's those who are trusted by the system. And getting people into the tent, whether it was personnel or capability, took not days or months, days or weeks, but months or years. And as a result, the whole system worked by telling people within the tent what to do. And we thought we were doing well in the National Cyber Force, and I'm proud of what we did. History will judge whether we went far enough and achieved enough. But Ukraine has turned that on its head, because what the Ukrainians have done is learn through necessity and at speed how to call for help. And they are asking for help from civilian society. They've got everyone from Anonymous and NAFO supporting them online, reaching out to that digital skills basis as a digital skills capability, brains trust, around the globe. They didn't build it, they just asked for it to move forward. And they've asked for capability, and whether it's farmers, tractors, or nation-state capabilities, they're getting what they need forward and fast, and then worrying about what to do with it. So my question is, if defence asked for help tomorrow, if it could ask for help, one, who would hear? And secondly, would it be days or years before a highly qualified, potentially highly motivated, potentially highly competent capability could contribute? And if they couldn't, does that speak to culture, process, organisation, or much more about what we need to modernise to really meet the challenge, the complexity of the modern world? Thanks, Ed. Back to you.
Sally, thank you. Very pithy as ever. You remind us that we shouldn't take the lessons from Ukraine and apply them to everywhere else, especially not China, but we shouldn't forget what we've learnt before. But I think that's a pivotal question, the one you raised there at the end. My understanding is Zelensky's got a 28-year-old whiz kid who's come back from the Bay Area, Ukrainian, and now they're moving at the speed and resourcefulness of Ukrainian farmers to get things that work, and they think of it in the morning and it works in the afternoon. And you've posed the question, do we chase the perfect so long that by the time it arrives it's no longer useful? What's the obsolescence loop in a world moving at digital speed? And so I'm going to move on to the next panellist, who was the other side of that National Cyber Force coin at one point, running a lot of the cyber for the UK Ministry of Defence. Phil Osborne, retired Air Marshal, ex-Chief of Defence Intelligence, and before that, careers split between operations in the Air Force, but also in the joint world, managing the equipment programme, looking at the future equipment we need, therefore looking at future warfare. Phil.
Edward, thank you. And I should say thank you to the Labour Party Policy Exchange and Northrop Grumman. I'm obviously here to raise the average age of those in the room, so if you could bear with me, that would be quite cool. I also wanted to apologise. I'm normally quite a happy person, but I have a sense that the next 5 minutes and perhaps the next 40 or 50 minutes might not be quite so happy. I want to argue, I suppose, that the defence policy of the UK is clearly not right. It's okay in some parts, but it's not right in others. And frankly, it wasn't right prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What that has done is exacerbated some of the issues that I think were there. In saying that, obviously, I'm sorry. Of course. So I'm being asked to speak up. You'll appreciate I listen through a machine and I'm the loudest thing in my head, which is a horrible thing. I said we need a fundamental shift in UK defence and security posture, not just capability, but posture. It's difficult to deny that there is a serious risk to national security. And we couldn't have said that 10 years ago, perhaps 5 years ago. What that means is we're probably at the end, firmly at the end, of an era of only fighting discretionary wars. That's where we've come from. We've come from a place where we used to do conflict because we chose to. What we're seeing in Europe at the moment means that's not a luxury we'll have in the future. And what we're seeing in Europe is probably the product of lazy deterrence. We've confused deterrence, from a UK point of view, with the deterrent. And deterrence is far more sophisticated than that. I mean, I think the human and economic crisis that is playing out in Europe at the moment, in Ukraine, underlines the need to convincingly deter, not to try and remediate once a bad thing has happened. So we have tended to rely on deterrence by punishment, the deterrent sanctions, which we're seeing play out. What we should really also have available to us is deterrence by denial. Actually making sure that the opposition think they will fail before they start to do that bad thing that goes counter to national and international interests. And is that expensive? Yes, of course it is. But let's think about how expensive the conflict in Ukraine will be and is today. The human and economic cost is astronomical. Deterrence by denial as a capability, I would offer, has got to be cheaper than that. And current defence and security policy does not. Thank you. I assume that's not because you want me to sing. Current defence and security policy doesn't really reflect this imperative for change. The integrated view, some of you will be familiar with it, is well written. The implementation of it, it is written in a resource-constrained envelope, actually I think is wanting. It doesn't address the long-standing balance, necessary balance between ambition and resource. And while Russia and China are addressed as clear threats, it doesn't really do the so what. This is all about implementation. It identifies, but it doesn't really say what we should be doing about it. So, for example, it does talk about digital capabilities, but it doesn't really talk about the need for increased hard power as well. These things are not an either or. You have to have both the digital capabilities that Sally and Nick have talked, and I'm sure we'll talk about, but you also have to have real mass to deter and maybe to remediate aggressive action. And it also doesn't talk a lot about resilience or defensive capabilities, our ability to protect the homeland, for example. So that transformation, what does it look like from a policy point of view? I think it falls into two areas. The first thing is we need more integrated resilience, better integrated resilience across the whole of the defence enterprise and society. That means resilient people, processes and stuff. That also means actually, and we've seen this during the pandemic as well as during recent events, if it's important to the nation, then the nation either needs to own it or have unimpeachably assured supply of it. And that is true of food and fuel and military weapons and military kit. And then once you've sorted and thought about and implemented that integrated resilience, the ability to withstand real sustained pressure, the like of which we've not seen in our generation, we probably need to think about delivering military capability for the digital age. And that is a requirement for hard and hybrid power, greatly enhanced by digital agility and capability, just as Nick highlighted. And that military power must be focused on three things: defending the homeland, fighting non-discretionary wars of survival, and also protecting the nation's interests, which by definition tends to be more discretionary. You cannot do one without the other two if you truly want to be secure in the 21st century. And all of this has to be in the context of alliances. Alliances are non-discretionary and they are a strategic strength, and we need to think about that and think about how we posture UK capability within the context of an alliance. We may come to that in questions. I just want to close on one word of caution about the pace of change. It is too easy to think about change happening in 2030. That is too late. The war in Europe is now, the implications are now, and we're living with them now, and therefore these are decisions that need to be taken and acted upon in the next few months and years. Edward, thank you.
No, Philip, thank you very much. You've introduced the ideas of national resilience. You've talked about that, and the wars we may have to fight are no longer discretionary, but those will cost more, and therefore you've floated the idea, if it's not costed, is the integrated review affordable? I mean, sure, we will come back to that. Sally mentioned Afghanistan before, and it's my great pleasure now to introduce the next panellist, Peymana Assad, who is I believe, the first person originally an Afghan to be elected to public office in this country. Congratulations. And you have then founded the foreign policy group of the Labour Party. A brilliant segue from Sally that we shouldn't forget the lessons of Afghanistan. I'm sure as you watched what was going on there a year ago, you had some thoughts about where defence money should be going. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Policy Exchange and to the panellists for sharing their views. I'm really honoured to be on this panel. I think as a daughter of an Afghan veteran, it's always really great to see that the armed forces are getting the attention that they rightly deserve and the platform that they rightly deserve. The Labour Foreign Policy Group is a member organisation. We are actually experts in foreign policy from the Labour Party, and we bring them together to discuss and debate ideas to push the Labour Party towards more progressive thinking on foreign policy issues. Obviously, the Labour Friends of the Forces and the Labour Campaign for International Development cover their respective fields, but we are more broader church around different ideas. So we have our focus groups on Russia and China. I have a China briefing. If you want to know more about the work that we do, I can hand that out afterwards. But I think it's really important what Sally mentioned about Afghanistan and the lessons that we need to learn from the Afghan war. The reason why I want to talk a little bit about the lessons that we need to learn from Afghanistan is because the UK actually trained Afghan national and defence security forces over the last 20 years. We withdrew, and Afghanistan was lost to the Taliban. The Taliban came back in. And I believe, and many foreign policy experts believe, that this gave inspiration to Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, one of the many reasons, because they saw a more isolationist United States under Trump, and also that under Biden, because he's dealing with all of the issues currently going on in the United States. The response from the UK Armed Forces community and veterans was to pressure, the MOD to evacuate Afghan allies from Afghanistan. It was because of veterans in the armed forces community that the evacuation actually took place. And we have to acknowledge that. And so we have lots of Afghans who have been evacuated thanks to veterans. And what does that leave behind? What kind of feeling does that leave behind in the veteran community? It needs a morale boost. You need to boost the morale for a war that has been lost in Afghanistan. And there are lessons to be learned because we need to redeem ourselves. I think the UK needs to redeem itself and learn the lessons from Afghanistan by not creating an army in our own image. We have the Ukrainian army to support and to allow them to be their authentic, fighting in an authentic way. And that means giving them the training and support that they need. And we should definitely not allow Ukraine to rely on NATO contractors. That's one of the reasons why we lost the war in Afghanistan. It's a huge lesson that must be learned, to not make our allies reliant on NATO contractors, because the moment we decide to leave the fight or to withdraw, those contractors also leave, and therefore that ally that we are supposed to be supporting is left by itself to defend itself. And the other point is listening to Ukraine on what is needed, and not distancing the voices of the Ukrainians itself, because they know exactly what they need on the ground, what weapons, what support is required. And why do we need to learn these lessons from Afghanistan? Because the war needs to be contained in Ukraine, and we can't allow Russia to come into mainland Europe. That is just the basic facts, and it is about defending the homeland, defending Europe, defending democracy. And I don't think that this war is going to end. It's not going to end in the next 6 months. We're looking at a very long-term war. If you see what's going on in Russia right now, they are pulling people out of their homes to inscript in the army and fight. So these people aren't exactly going to be the most trained individuals fighting in the Russian army. So we have a leeway, we have a space here to try and shift from crisis mode to campaigning long-term with the Ukrainians. So I think that we need to analyze our economic ability to support, especially under the current recession and our cost of living crisis that we face, and bridge the gap between the public and the political support, because we know that the politics is behind Ukraine, but it is the public that needs to come with it long term, because what we don't want to do is what we did in Afghanistan, is for 20 years fighting a war that actually the public lost interest in, but the government was specifically interested in. And I do think deterrence is working. I know that there are different views on the panel, but I think that we need to keep at it. And I think that it's right to say that there needs to be thought about different types of deterrence. And it might be deterrence that members of the Labour Party might not be comfortable with, Liberals in the UK might not be comfortable with, but we'll have to use in the future. But I think balance is needed. We do need to, on the human rights front, support Ukraine to record evidence of Russian atrocities, to make sure that that is documented and that Ukrainians are supported in doing that, and support Ukraine in developing pathways for physical and mental treatment of their soldiers, because that is really, really important for them on the ground. I think that it's really important that we learn the lessons from Afghanistan and that we allow the UK armed forces to redeem itself in Ukraine, and we win the war in Ukraine so that we defend democracy here at home. Thank you.
Well, that's superb. Really a treatise on all the aspects of what we would call the moral component, even down to making sure the nation is behind you, which is why it's so important to discuss these things at these political conferences. And you remind us that you've got to understand the people you're helping, and you have to help them in such a way, maybe not via contractors, where you have skin in the game. There is an empathy there, and you remind us often we're in it for the long haul, which brings us back to the politics and taking the nation with you, which is a great segue to our final panellist, Luke Pollard, MP, member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, another man who has no illusions about what it's really like to be in the armed forces, with your father as a submariner for many years. And if I could call on you to give us your thoughts from the political perspective, but also maybe sweep up some of those elements that have gone before from the other panellists. Luke, over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Edward. Good morning, all. I'm very proud to be the son of a submariner, and I'm very proud to represent a military city. And I think it has not always been easy for those in our movement who are interested in a strong defence to make that case. But as the phrase goes, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And if we are to be a credible government, if we are to be a party that people can trust to protect our interests as a nation and protect the people, we need to be strong on defence. And there is no doubt in my mind that with John Healey as the Shadow Defence Secretary, we have that type of leadership in the team, and I'm very proud to be part of his team in doing this. Now, I think we as a party are confronted by an extraordinary international situation. That means that we need to test the assumptions that as a movement we put into how we define our decision making around defence and security. As a party, we have been very clear that we back the government in supporting our friends in Ukraine. That means we make the case for the continued support for our Ukrainian friends in provision of military equipment, for provision of intelligence, for making sure that we are supporting people who are fleeing Ukraine, but also being clear that the conclusion of this war must end in Russian failure. It must be set by the terms of the Ukrainian government. There's a temptation, sometimes you hear this in the political debate in Parliament. There was a debate that I opened for the Labour Party on Ukraine only a few days ago, where there's voices on the right calling for an off-ramp. And what they mean by an off-ramp is the ability to accept that large chunks of Ukraine that have been illegally occupied by Russia will remain in Russian hands. A satisfactory conclusion to the war is one that is defined by Ukraine. And we need to support them in doing so. But that also means we need to test where we are. Now, as a party, we've been very critical of the integrated review. And when we say the integrated review, in a room full of defence experts, you'll know it's not just one document, but when you're making the case to the public, it needs to be defined as one. The integrated review had a reasonable strategic assessment. I think most of us would kind of get that. The problem is the Defence Command paper and the approach that came with it was unambitious and made, in our view, an incorrect assumption about what should happen. There has been underfunding of our military for the past 12 years. And so Labour has said, if the government increases defence spending, we will back you. But that needs to be accompanied by a rebooting of your defence strategy, looking again at some of the lessons that we've got. And that means, I think, challenging the assumption that it's okay to cut 10,000 roles from the army, challenging the assumption it's okay to cut the number of aircraft that we have, recognising that reducing the number of hulls that the Royal Navy has is a problem, and that cutting 10% of our reserves creates instability to be able to reinforce those frontline operational units. There's real challenges here. And how we make that case as a party is important, because the lessons that we're learning from Ukraine aren't just about the resilience of that people, the courage of their military. It's about what it means for our tactics and strategy, what it means for deterrence. And if we're making the case that we should be opposing Russia in terms of their illegal invasion, well, we need to be making the case that we need to be standing up against Russian oligarchs and dirty Russian money that has flooded the London property market and, if we're being very honest, has flooded our politics too. That means standing up in the way that the government is simply unprepared to do because they are benefiting from that. So Labour's got to make that affirmative case for a better one. But we also need to look at the proposals. So we're in the period where we are likely to have a triple whammy of integrated reviews. We've already had one, we're having a new one with the Conservatives, and we will have one under Labour, because when the election comes, we will have a Labour government. We have to fight and earn it, but we will. So that means we need to look at what are the bits and the assumptions we take into it. We are entering a period of contest that we have not seen for a very, very long time. And that means we need to have a different understanding about hard power, about the size of our military, about the capabilities of our military. But we also need to recognise that it's no longer sufficient to have lots of tanks. We need to make sure that we've got a cyber defence, defensive and offensive setup that goes alongside it. Now that is hard, because when we hear our colleagues on the panel talk about the importance of cyber, I agree with them. But it is really hard making the case to the general public that what we need to do is invest in spotty teenagers in basements. Because that is not what cyber is. But that is often what the public think cyber is. So if we are to make a case that actually we need to enhance our military capabilities by investing more in cyber, we have to make the case for cyber. We have to understand how it integrates with hard power, how it is not an optional extra that we have on the side, but it is an absolute key part of our national defence. Because each and every day, the United Kingdom is under attack. Each and every day, our cyber forces are rebutting attacks on our key infrastructure, not just our military infrastructure, but our civilian infrastructure in particular, where there is a larger number of vulnerabilities than I think as a nation we want to be honest with ourselves about. So we do need to make that case. And that is where I think, as a party, we need to be serious about defence. So when John Healey and Keir Starmer says our commitment to NATO is unshakable, it is because NATO is a Labour construct. It was built by a Labour government. It is true to Labour values. Our values as a party must not end at the border. We are an internationalist party at our core. And sometimes making the case for strong investment in defence, a strong foreign policy, an ethical foreign policy that recognises the consequences of the contested environment we're in, does require us to make a moral case. And we've heard that very well. But it also requires us to make a case that can be supported by the public. Because at this very moment, the idea of increasing defence spending is for some people in the public not something they agree with. But I'm afraid, whether we are interested in war or not, it has come to our shores. In terms of cyber, it's coming to Europe, in terms of Russian aggression, and the instability that we're seeing around the world, and the retreat of Western dominance, the hegemony of the Western powers in places elsewhere around the world, Africa in particular, the Middle East elsewhere, needs to recognise that we're in a different place. So, going into the next election, my final points, Labour needs to be strong on defence. We have good defence policies. We need to not only fix a broken procurement system that has rewarded failure for far too long, Ajax being the best model of a broken system in procurement, but we need to make sure that we are making sure that our armed forces are getting the support they need, the resources they need, because having large chunks of our military under strength is not a sustainable position for the UK at this contested time. And then we need to make sure that we're making that case that the public can believe. That's why we not only need to make sure that this is a hygiene factor, that people look at Labour and say, do you know what? Yes, I agree with John Healey. I agree with Keir on defence. They can think that we can defend our country and put trust in it, but that our values will win throughout. Now, that is a big challenge, but we need to do that because if we are not strong on defence, just as equally as we're not strong on law and order, not strong on the other hygiene factors that voters choose, we will lose. And I'm afraid 5 more years of this Conservative government on nearly every policy area, including defence, is not one that I think is in Britain's best interests. So we have a big challenge ahead of us, but I think we do that by having an informed debate, informed decisions, and a strong outcome at the end. So that's something that I'm really keen to hear your views on, and I'm grateful for the panel and for Policy Exchange for putting this discussion on, because actually more discussions about our strategy, about our resourcing, capabilities, and about the threats not we're facing. I like the point, 2030 is too far away, and it is, whether it's about climate, whether it's about defence, we're facing those challenges right now. So how do we react to them? And I think at the moment, we are supporting the government on the headlines, but we're asking legitimate questions about the detail that sits behind. And that is what a constructive opposition preparing for government should be doing. Thank you.
Luke, thank you very much. I mean, you reminded us that it's not your choice whether war is interested in you, and one thinks of those typically young women in Ukraine at the moment talking about what they had in mind for their careers, but how now they are committed to removing the invader, and we should all take heed of that. And you mentioned the fact that the Defence Command paper and the integrated review didn't really mesh. I think most commentators would absolutely agree on that, and therefore the Defence Command paper does not step up and answer the questions the integrated review poses, which essentially does get to how much can you be prepared to spend on defence. I'm sure that will come back up in the Q&A. And you remind us very usefully that we're talking here about national defence, and a lot of our critical national infrastructure is in private hands, especially in the cyber domain. So before we go out to Q&A with the audience, I'm going to throw 2 sets of questions back at the panel while you're all thinking about what you would like to answer. For those in and around government and politics, principally Luke, yourself and Phil, I'll come back to you in a second and just ask you to explore that idea of how easy is it to create a national strategy, especially as Labour has the time out of government now to think about how it might work across department. Can we break down those stovepipes? Is a point that Sally made earlier as well. But I want to come first and bring Nick and Sally back in, because these ideas of national resilience, these ideas of the whole of the country having, when you're at war, it's a nation that goes to war. You have to pull national capacities together, and a lot of those are software driven, as we're seeing now, the Ukrainians linking Elon Musk Starlink to commercially procured drones to your bog standard laptop and absolutely outthinking the Russians at speed. But how well constructed are we across the sort of the UK government as its executive branch, the way it deals with industry, in being able to procure quickly, a point everyone has made, software capacities? So it's back to that idea of not waiting to get the perfect by 2030. We might need it tomorrow, and it would better work. And I'm very conscious that Sally is sort of hidden off the screen there. So maybe, Nick, if I could get Sally to come in first on that, because a lot of what the capabilities she provided for this country were software driven, and then come to you as an integrating prime. So Sally and then Nick.
So I'll talk to the skills piece first, which is a real challenge. Working with companies now that have got people who want to help government and help defence. But there's two routes. One is to go and work for a prime who've got an existing contract, and the other route is to become a civil servant or to become a paid up member of the forces. And we absolutely, urgently, desperately need that third route, which is just, I've got a good idea, I've got a good brain, I could be useful on this problem at this moment in time, and find a way to harness that individual or that organisation or that team to the national effort at any time of need. Because that is the only way we're going to get the agility into our resilience piece. The foundations need to be there, but we also need to be operating at speed when we identify problems.
Let me pick up a couple of points that Sally's making, but also go a bit further on kind of the situation. So at the beginning, I mentioned the move to digital capability and software-defined, hardware-enabled solutions. That tendency is going to build. We have no choice about that because that's the way the world is moving. And it's fair to say that the UK Ministry of Defence and procurement organisations are not used to procuring in that way, because those systems will be updated in the same way your phone is on a regular basis with new capabilities, and we do not have a procurement model or indeed a commercial model that supports that way of operations. There's a real transformation in defence acquisition that is coming and needs to come to make that work. And that's going to require different skills within the MOD and within the armed forces to deploy them, and different skills in industry to respond appropriately to them. And this is where I absolutely agree with Sally that skills is probably one of our biggest issues. At Northrop Grumman, we work very hard to support a wide range of SMEs to drive innovation in the technology base, and that's extraordinarily valuable to us. But supporting those SMEs from government is critical, and supporting the skills they need, we need, and that government needs in the software-defined, hardware-enabled world is critical. And I suspect, like many industry colleagues, we are struggling to find the skills we need in the UK to deliver the requirements we wish to deliver for the UK Armed Forces today. And I don't see that getting easier in the future, I see it getting harder. So we need to look at how we develop skills, how we develop young people into software engineers and digitally capable individuals, how we get things like computer programming and software engineering into the national curriculum, because they're the skills we're going to need in the next decade if we're going to defend the UK.
So some fantastic policy points there. I'm sure you'll pick up on later on. National skills is all about prosperity agenda. It's all about growth as well, and how can perhaps defence be used to stimulate that. And Sally raises the point about SMEs, and all I'll say here is that I have friends with some brilliant startup companies. They've got fantastic globally leading products. Because they're globally leading, they've got no track record by definition, and then government finds it very hard to deal with them, and they go elsewhere. And all that is going to waste. I know, but I won't say any more on that because the Policy Exchange panel tomorrow under Benjamin is going to explore that at some length. So, fantastic answers. If I could come here, and I'm going to turn to Phil first, as a member of that executive sat in trying to work across government departments. How good are government at coming up with these national strategies that pull the departments together? And then I'll come to you for your thoughts about how you might approach that as a government in waiting. So, Phil.
See, that's such a leading question, isn't it? When we're actually picking it apart and saying how good a government at it. Could I come back with one point on resilience? There's a responsibility on industry to take responsibility for their supply chain.
True.
And to recognise that supply chain has to be resilient in times of conflict as well as times, let's call it relative peace. This is not my fault.
No, I'm just, Claire might come up and give you the Pebble Mill at One farewell song microphone. Yeah.
It's probably fair to say that any government would struggle to integrate all of the aspects of what we've talked about from a national security point of view. It touches every part of society if you are thinking about fighting wars of survival, deterring aggression at the existential threat level. It needs strong, clear, centralized leadership, and the reason for that is not to drive through ideas so much as to prioritize. And it is prioritization that I think governments find most difficult. It's the things you're not going to do, as opposed to the things that you want to do, which always falls in the way of integrated activity across departments. Departments end up as tribes within the Ministry of Defence. That is also true. So, for example, from a Ministry of Defence point of view, one of the things that I would expect future governments to consider is reversing some of the what are called Levine reforms, which effectively outsource decision-making to those tribes, to the frontline commands. If you want to drive transformational change, you cannot do it by committee, regrettably, and therefore it has to have strong central leadership. I think that is true of defence as well as it is of government.
Thank you. And just a major policy thought there. Levine essentially encourages tribalism in an era where we're saying we have to knit everything together. I would absolutely agree with that myself, for what it's worth. How would, approaching this as a minister-to-be, how would you think about how you would be managing the executive to achieve some of the benefits that the other panellists are looking for?
It's a good question. I think the best discussion of Levine reforms are often in a pub with a pint, because what you get people doing is it gets people really passionate, really determined about it. And the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Having a procurement system whereby you can't paint a wall or fix a light bulb because somewhere miles away has to approve it in triplicate seems a really dumb system. But having a system that is overly devolved also might not always produce the integration that we need. Now, I don't believe between those two extremes there's not a better place for us to be. So I think we do need that debate. But I think when we're looking at our technology and our skills base for defence, but also for the advanced manufacturing that we need that supports our civilian industries as well, we need to recognise that at the moment we're not growing enough of our own talent. We are wasting too much of that talent, and we're losing too much of that talent on the supply chain as we go through. But we also need to look again at the procurement. So one of the questions that I ask when I go around military bases, which is probably not giving away any state secrets, is what operating system does that computer use? Because do you remember that green start bar on Windows 98? Because I see a lot of green start bars. And that worries me because that's a very long time ago. And although many of these systems are standalone, so without USB ports, so in theory can't be got at, there's a challenge about how we make sure that our armed forces can use the latest in technology to do so. And I think what we've seen in Ukraine actually is, by necessity, innovation driving better outcomes. What we've also seen is a challenge to the strategy that we would normally have. And that's a strategy not only for UK armed forces, but on a strategic level, a NATO strategy as well. And if we are seeing a Russian aggression that is primarily focused on an artillery bombardment that wipes out entire populations, the NATO strategy of pushing Russia back in the Baltic states by letting them invade and then pushing them back may not be one that is fit for the 21st century. So there are some bigger challenges here. And I think the space we've got to get at is a debate and a discussion whereby this type of inquiry is allowed, that permission is given for us to ask questions about it, because quite a lot of the really good questioning that we get in our armed forces comes from the academic side. But academic sides are often looking backwards. And what we need is recommendations about how we adapt in the future. Now, I do not believe that within the defence industries that we have in our armed forces and our civilian setup, that there's not the skills to have that. But it needs to be a discussion that is more permissible, and where ingenuity, innovation is rewarded, or at least not shut down immediately. And I think there is a culture that we need to address, not just in terms of technology transformation, not just in terms of leadership, but a culture within these settings about how you get better outcomes from it. And hopefully that will get rid of all those green taskbars, start bars that we see on the screens when you go around a military base or go onto Royal Navy warships, because we need to give our troops and our folks that work on the front line the very best equipment, the very best chance of not only surviving contact with the enemy, but winning in that scenario. And that does mean the best skills, the best equipment, the best capabilities, and the best strategy. And at the moment, I think there are improvements that can be made on all of those.
Yeah, brilliant. The balance in Levine to get the benefits of local entrepreneurism to achieve efficiencies, but actually have a design authority that builds the whole, whereas at the moment, as you said, innovative thought can be stymied because these tribes have established ways of thinking, and those can become quite ossified. So actually, I would argue Levine tends to encourage groupthink as well. So I think there are some great
More
great
purple. I think that's a good way of describing it. It's more purple because the armed forces are really good at doing joint stuff.
Yeah.
And actually, we need more joint approach. That doesn't mean that we need to dilute or remove the single services, but the idea that when you join any branch of armed forces, that part of your career will be purple, but the way you function and operate will be purple, i.e. working across the armed surface that you're in to make sure that you're working with, if you're in the Army, working with the Royal Navy and the Air Force and intelligence services and vice versa. I think that is a good way of doing it.
Well, you mentioned doing that over a beer earlier on, and Phil and I will keep you all afternoon with our thoughts on that, but I think
Exactly.
I'd say we'd be signed up to that too. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I thought I'd open it to the floor now. Have we got the microphone? That was a first and very insistent hand went up, so sir, if you are representing an agency, could I, and then I'll come down to the front here, I think.
Good morning, Mike Suri from Dorset South. I'm very much with Air Marshal Osborne in being of a generally happy disposition, and what we are looking at is extremely black, particularly the shocking atrocities and the torture carried out by what seems to be, to me, an indisciplined army. And whether that is a point that we've learnt, in my military career, we rather ascribed, quite professionalism to the Russians, but I'm not really sure we're seeing that. And I wonder in a way if that is a chink of light, and that because of Russian society, the repression, the closed nature of it, the fed propaganda, and these days, of course, they are beginning to recognize it as propaganda, whether we can rely on an incompetent, corrupt army where soldiers sell their weapons as soon as they get them. And that's, and we're seeing that play out on the battlefield. So really my question is has that been a learning point? Can we rely, generally speaking, on incompetence?
Phil, do you want to take that from, especially as the next Chief of Defence Intelligence, and I'll come to Paymana.
I think we have to remember that those who would wish potentially to do the UK and allies harm are not just Russia. So the lessons you learn about Russian capability do not necessarily read across to other nations' capabilities. I think what we're seeing, though, from a Russian point of view is the importance of training and the importance of a assured logistic supply chain apparatus, whatever you want to call it. Russian logistics is systemically corrupt, and their training levels are nothing like ours. However, it's not just about training and logistics. And when we talk about a balanced military capability, that's got to be training with the right things and operating in the right way. Now, we can do that in a different way in the future, a lot more simulation, etc. But presenting a holistic military capability, a holistic national defense and security capability is where Russia has fallen down, and we would be wise to learn that lesson.
Thanks, Phil. Paymana, could I ask you just to pick up on the foreign policy aspects of essentially what's a sort of with a NATO question? Where are the threats going? If Russia looks bankrupt, what should NATO be thinking?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the point on the Russian human rights atrocities in Ukraine. If we look back in history, it's not new. What Russia did in Afghanistan in the 1980s was horrific, but because there was no social media at the time and it wasn't reported in such a large scale by civilians themselves, people didn't know about it in such a widespread way that we do now today. So I think that we should always keep that in mind. In terms of looking forward and NATO's response to Russia in the future, I think that it's really important that NATO keeps a unified stance on this. And it's different to how it acted in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, every single army had its own strategy, its own thinking in different provinces, in different ways. We cannot do that with Ukraine. And that's, I think, the lesson going forward that needs to be learned by NATO, that it needs to come together, it needs to have a unified strategy across from the United States to Germany to other European countries. It cannot just be every country with its own strategy, with its own thought of how it's going to support Ukraine. Because the threats that Russia is facing itself, if you look at the Central Asian regions, you see Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all the Central Asian regions are right now in wars between themselves, but nobody's paying attention to what's happening on Russia's southern border. So Russia's facing a huge amount of threat from the south and also on this, the Ukrainian border. So I think going forward, I think NATO needs to show a more unified strategy, not just individual strategies on how it responds to Russia.
Thank you very much. So a theme here of coordinating and putting things together, and once again back to that, the internationalist approach of actually working with our alliances from the bottom up, not stitching them together at the end as required. Now, could I ask you two gentlemen here who had your hands up to give 2 quick questions? We'll take them at the same time, and then I'll spin them around the panel. That will probably take us up to
Thank you.
the end.
Riccardo Tordera from the Payments Association. I will leave on Russia because we have spoke about it quite a lot, but I'm concerned about China and I haven't heard much about it. So China is now able to settle money instantly throughout its own digital yuan. This is going to change the entire payments landscape in the world, and they're able to offer it throughout all the Belt and Road Initiative countries, which is a direct challenge to the Western power. Like if we think of how we have been fighting also the war in Ukraine now, it's throughout the payment system by blocking access to the people we don't want to. But let's imagine that a sovereign nation of the scale of China is able to operate without any sort of Western control on this and move money without us being able to intervene or stop what they're going to do. So this is something that's also defense related, but it's a new kind of defense. It's like what you were saying before. It's not conventional war, it's very unconventional. So what is the Labour response to this? That would be really interesting to know.
Yes, Nigel Gould-Davis, I'm the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The point about resilience is critical, of course. It reminds us this is a war being fought on 2 fronts. One is by military means in the field, and the other is by economic and informational means on our home front. And Russia is still trying to undermine will and morale there, playing games with gas taps and all the rest of it. And that does mean, as you suggested, that economic policy now, especially going into the winter, energy regulatory policy are also security policy. And that's also true of oligarchic money. And we've gone a long way there, but there's more to do. On the specific point that Sally made about the importance of initiative and agility, it seems to me there's a recent unhappy experience here. And that was the response to the national challenge of the pandemic. My understanding is there were plenty of people from industry who came forward in the early days and offered solutions on things like personal protective equipment, and they were largely ignored. That's from media reports, that's the picture I've got, and instead things were contracted in other ways. So if that's the case, is there some better lesson to draw about how we make use of the tide of genuine willingness to help and initiative from below that we may hope for in this case? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Luke, could I come to you, because it was very expressly aimed at China, Labour's policy. We've heard a lot about Russia, not so much about China. Over to you.
Yeah, in a fringe about Ukraine, you're probably getting more Russia than you will China, but I take your point. We have not just one potential adversary, and we have a range of different challenges internationally. Now, our economic strength has always been the advantage since the post-Second World War, that the West was able to leverage that, and we are not in that same position now. And so we do need to reflect that the challenges and security challenges will be different elsewhere. One of Labour's key aspects that we have been concerned about is the ability of the UK government to spread ourselves too thin in terms of our military posture. So a tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which has been part of the last integrated review, has left, I think, large parts of the Euro-Atlantic not getting the focus, at least in policy terms, that it deserves. But we do need to work with our allies to make sure that this is the case and to support our allies. And if you look at the AUKUS deal that was done with our friends in Australia about provision of submarine technology, for instance, I think there are opportunities for the UK PLC in the wider sense, to support a security environment change in the Asia-Pacific region without necessarily us deploying forces there. But we will need to recognise that actually economic power and Chinese economic power is going to be significant, and we only need to look at what Russia tried to or is doing with its hydrocarbons to see that being very valid. I would just say to Nigel on resilience, resilience is not a sexy topic in politics. It is something that is absolutely essential, that gets hardly enough airtime, and we don't, I think, have a national debate that talks about resilience in a proper way. You mentioned PPE contracts. Unless you're a Tory donor, I think the PPE procurement was an utter disaster, and we need to learn the lessons from that about where it comes. But we also need to recognise that the information that is being shared in our social feeds right now across the country is not just what people had for breakfast on their Instagram. It's deliberate misinformation. The problem is, at times over the past 10 years, the government has benefited from misinformation, so it has not always shut it down the way they wanted to, but that means we've left the door open. And we need to be much better at challenging misinformation, fake news, and have a culture where truth matters again. There can be a debate around perspectives, absolutely, but we must make truth matter again. And that means being absolutely determined that lies should not be part of our political narrative. But sadly, as we know from the past few years, lies has become a key aspect of government communications in our country, which makes it harder for us to challenge other countries that are doing exactly that. So there's lots of lessons for us to learn from our own experience, not just from the experience of other nations as well.
Thank you. And a perfect segue to Sally, if I can come to you. Principally on that second question that talked about that, and China, especially China's ability to pull all these strands together in a sort of full court press against us using informational economic levers. Could I just ask you to pick up the second question on the floor, as you sat there in GCHQ, were looking across government, not just in the military sphere, at how countries like China can use all those levers of national power, especially in the cyber and digital domains. Did you not pick up the question from the floor?
I'm just struggling to hear a little bit in the room, Ed. So what I heard was a little bit of a thought on China, its strategic approach to whole of government.
Yeah.
Kind of. Is that what you want to quick inject on?
Did you?
So I think hopefully from the Ukrainian front, you've got past the worst of the misrepresentation of cyber war, because I don't think any such thing exists. I think the Chinese are showing us what strategic statecraft looks like, which is absolute clarity on how to change the rules of the game to their benefit. And I think they are extraordinarily capable. I said at the outset, I don't think Russia is China. I think Russia, what you see from the Russians is their statecraft playing out in the digital world. So it's thuggish, it's criminal, it's at large scale, but it's not really integrated into anything, and it's not actually very effective. The Chinese, nothing could be further from the truth. They are setting their goals out 20, 30 years. They are looking at where the West is deriving power and influence, and they are seeking to change the rules of the road so that they can operate differently and remove those capabilities and levers from us. How you counter that? You do it through strong alliances, through debate that is longer term, more strategic in nature, and through much cleverer brains than mine. So I will throw it back to the room with that probably slightly inadequate answer.
Lots of nods in the room that you couldn't see, Sally, so thank you very much. And probably the last answer from the panellists on that, the broader economics of it all. Nick.
No, thank you. I would probably just reiterate both Luke and Sally's points, which is what we're seeing is China using its extraordinary economic power now to become a defense and security power. It is investing in building one of the largest maritime fleets in the world, one of the largest fleets of submarines in the world. It's innovating in the airspace. It is, as we've already talked about, extraordinarily active in the cyber domain. It has more resources in the cyber domain than much of the Western world. And in wider armed forces, it is using the latest technology to get ahead of us in terms of defense capability. And that's the real risk. I think for many years, both economically, as Luke said, but also technologically in defense, the West has had the leading edge. We've all had a 5 to 10 year advantage over our potential adversaries in terms of defense technology, and therefore could be extraordinarily confident that when it came to a fight, we would win. I don't believe that's true any longer. And China particularly has invested in leading edge technologies, has leapfrogged on some of the capabilities that the West has had, and may well be close to a technological edge in defense. And that should worry us, because they then have with both their economic power and defense power, have the ability to exert their power and will. And therefore it becomes a very big political issue in terms of how we respond to that. I think what we've talked about in terms of innovating defense is the solution, but how we do that, both politically and in terms of delivering the economics of that, is the big challenge of our next generation, probably.
Nick, thank you. Well, we've ended on the big challenge of the generation for any incoming government, so plenty to take away. I've overrun slightly. I do apologise. It's just over the hour from when we actually started. You'll be very pleased to know that Policy Exchange has identified some of these things. There is now someone employed looking just at resilience across, across, and I hope there'll be paper coming out soon that links what's going on in Ukraine with energy security, with the cost of living crisis back here, to point out that all these things are linked. And indeed, some of these ideas will be taken forward. Benjamin's panel, this place tomorrow in about an hour's time, will be drilling down into that. So all that's left for me to do is to thank the PX staff who arrived late yesterday and have set this whole thing up, the battery of cameras et al., and managed to get Sally in. I would like to thank the panellists for giving up their time and coming here, all five of you, and Sally for finding the way to dial in and cope when you can't see the room. I think you've done brilliantly. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, could I thank our sponsors, via you, Nick, Northrop Grumman, for funding this, which I think, as we've all agreed, as you very eloquently pointed out, Luke, is a very important debate for us all, whether we think we're interested in defence and security or not. So I could just ask you all, please, to thank our sponsor and our panellists and use the way.